The stone door sits at the base of a mesa in northern New Mexico, half buried in red earth, and for over a century, no one has been able to open it. Not because it's locked, not because it's sealed with some ancient mechanism nobody understands, but because every team that has tried has, for one reason or another, stopped. Equipment fails. Permits revoked. Researchers walk away mid-project and never speak of it again. Is it coincidence? Bureaucracy? Or is there something behind that slab of stone that we were never meant to find? What follows is not a ghost story. It's a documented, if fragmented, trail of expeditions, oral histories, and abandoned paperwork. A mystery that has outlived the people who tried to solve it. To understand why this stone door matters, you have to understand the land it sits on. Northern New Mexico is a place layered with history most visitors never see beneath the surface. Ancestral Puebloan communities lived across this region for well over 1,000 years, building multi-story stone dwellings, intricate irrigation systems, and ceremonial structures whose full purpose is still debated by archaeologists today. Chaco Canyon, roughly 150 miles from where our story is centered, remains one of the most sophisticated examples of pre-Columbian architecture in North America, a UNESCO World Heritage whose alignments with the sun and moon still puzzle researchers. It's within this broader context, a landscape proven and again to hide complexity beneath apparent emptiness, that stories of a sealed door first began to circulate among ranching families in the area. According to local oral tradition, passed down through generations of families who worked this land, there has long been talk of a hollow place inside the mesa, a chamber or perhaps a passage that predates any structure currently standing. Elders in some nearby pueblos spoken, in general and often deliberately vague terms, of areas within the region considered off-limits, not because of danger in a physical sense, but because certain places were understood to hold significance that outsiders were not meant to disturb. It's important to say clearly, these are oral traditions, not physical evidence. They should be treated with the same respect we'd give any culture's account of its own land and history, not as proof of a hidden structure, but as a thread worth taking seriously, because indigenous oral histories in this region, on multiple prior occasions, pointed researchers toward real archaeological sites that official records had missed entirely. Layered on top of these older traditions a second, more recent strand of folklore, stories from homesteaders and ranchers in the late 1800s and early 1900s, described finding a smooth, rectangular slab of stone set into the mesa wall, clearly shaped by human hands, with no visible hinges, no seams, and no clear point of entry. Some described faint carvings near its edges. Others insisted it produced a strange, low hum if you pressed your palm to it, though this detail, understandably, falls firmly into the territory of legend rather than fact. What we can say with more confidence is, land surveys from the early 20th century do reference an unusual rock formation in the area, described by one surveyor's notes as artificial in appearance, though its function could not be determined. That phrase, artificial in appearance, is doing a lot of work. It suggests that even to trained eyes, this was not simply a natural rock face. Something about it looked deliberate. So the question becomes, was this door built by the ancestral communities who lived here for centuries? Was it something older still? Or was it, as some skeptics have long argued, nothing more than a natural erosion pattern that folklore slowly transformed into something more? The turning point, the moment this stone door went from local legend to genuine investigative mystery, came in 1962. That year, a small survey team from a state-level historical preservation office was cataloging rock art and structural sites across several counties in northern New Mexico as part of a broader effort to document at-risk archaeological features before increased ranching and road development disturbed them further. The team was led by a field archaeologist whose detailed notes, preserved in regional archive collections, describe locating what he called a worked stone panel approximately 6 feet in height, embedded flush into the mesa face. His notes go further. He measured the slab at just under 2 feet wide, with edges that appeared too regular for natural fracture, and described a faint border of geometric etching running along its perimeter, worn, weathered, but consistent enough to suggest deliberate craftsmanship rather than accident. Crucially, his notes mention something else, a narrow, dark seam running along one edge of the slab, what he interpreted as a possible gap between the stone and whatever lay behind it. In his own words, preserved in the archived report, further excavation would be required to determine whether this feature is load-bearing or entrance to an interior space. That single sentence, entrance to an interior space, is the origin point of everything that followed. The team requested authorization to excavate around the slab, hoping to determine whether it was purely ornamental or whether it did, in fact, seal something behind it. According to surviving correspondence, that authorization was initially granted. A follow-up excavation was scheduled for the following spring. It never happened. The lead archaeologist's involvement with the site ends abruptly in the records. There's no dramatic final entry, no note of resignation or reassignment, just silence. The project simply stops appearing in subsequent quarterly reports. When a research assistant working under him was asked, decades later, in a recorded regional history interview, why the excavation was never completed, her answer was frustratingly vague. She recalled some kind of funding issue, and separately that the site had been reclassified, though she couldn't say by whom or why. Reclassified. That word alone raises more questions than it answers. Interest in the stone door resurfaced in 1979, when a graduate researcher from a state university, working on a thesis about regional Puebloan-era architecture, rediscovered the original 1962 survey notes in an archive and decided to relocate the site herself. According to her later writings, she found the slab largely as described, still embedded in the mesa, still bearing faint geometric markings, though more weathered than the original report suggested. She petitioned for a small excavation grant to investigate the seam along the slab's edge, the same detail that had stopped researchers cold 17 years earlier. Her request was approved. Fieldwork began in the summer of 1980. Within 3 weeks, according to her own account, the excavation was suspended. She cited 2 separate reasons in different interviews over the years. First, that the university had reallocated funding to a different project deemed a higher priority. And second, and more candid interview, that a landowner dispute had emerged to that section of the mesa, one she described as unusually forceful for what should have been a routine permissions issue. She left academia a few years later and, as far as public records show, never returned to the site or discussed it publicly again in detail. 2 separate research efforts, 17 years apart, both stopped just as they approached the same threshold. That pattern alone is enough to make you lean forward. But it's also, as we'll get into, exactly the kind of pattern that skeptics say tells you more about how research funding and land access actually work than it does about any hidden secret behind the stone. If you're the kind of person who likes digging past the headline and actually sitting with the evidence, the real records, not just the legend, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe, because we're about to walk through what official investigators actually found when they finally got close enough to test that door for real, and why what they found only deepened the mystery rather than closing it. Let's talk about what official skepticism actually looks like here, because it would be irresponsible to tell this story without it. The most obvious explanation, the one most archaeologists would reach for first, is geology, not mystery. Northern New Mexico's mesas are made up of sedimentary rock, primarily sandstone, laid down in distinct horizontal layers over millions of years. Erosion along these layers can, under the right conditions, produce startlingly regular, almost architectural-looking shapes. Freeze-thaw cycles, wind erosion, and mineral banding can create the illusion of cut edges, seams, and even faint linear patterns that, to an untrained eye, or even to an excited one, might look deliberately carved. Geologists who have reviewed photographs and field notes from the site without direct access, it should be said, have offered exactly this explanation. One regional geologist, commenting generally on formations of this type rather than this specific site, noted that the human brain is exceptionally good at finding pattern and intention in natural randomness. It's called pareidolia, and it's the same reason people see faces in clouds. That's a fair and important caution, and it deserves real weight here. But it doesn't fully explain everything in the record. It doesn't explain why a trained geologist in 1962, someone whose entire career was built on distinguishing natural folklore, described the edges as two natural fracture. It doesn't explain the consistent detail described independently by two separate researchers 17 years apart, neither of whom appears to have had access to the other's notes at the time of their own fieldwork, and it doesn't fully explain why two separate, well-documented research efforts, decades apart, under completely different institutions, both stalled at almost the exact same stage of investigation. So, what's the official position today? Here's where things get frustratingly quiet. The site does not appear on any current, publicly listed state historical register. When researchers and independent investigators have submitted formal information requests to relevant state and county offices over the years, responses: some offices report no wrecking the site's description. Others report that older survey files may have been reclassified as private landowner property and are therefore not subject to public disclosure in the same way. Reclassified as private landowner property. That phrase turns up again, an echo of the same word used decades earlier, and it's worth sitting with because it's not actually a wild conspiracy. Land ownership boundaries genuinely do shift over time. Reclassification is a mundane bureaucratic event 9 times out of 10. Sites get reassigned, funding priorities shift, and paperwork simply gets lost. That's the far less dramatic and, frankly, far more statistically likely explanation. But the 10th time is the one that keeps this story alive. There's also the human factor, which deserves mention. Small research grants in regional archaeology have always been fragile, chronically underfunded, and vulnerable to being deprioritized the moment something more fundable comes along. It's entirely plausible, maybe even probable, that both the 1962 and 1980 investigations were victims of nothing more sinister than bad timing, tight budgets, and the ordinary attrition of academic careers. Researchers change fields. Universities cut programs. That's not a cover-up. That's just how underfunded fieldwork often ends, quietly and without closure. Which brings us to a strange and largely overlooked thread that connects this story to something much farther away. In the early 1990s, a separate research effort, this one focused on cataloging rock art panels across the greater Southwest, spanning parts of New Mexico, Arizona, and southern Colorado, documented a series of geometric border patterns strikingly similar to the ones described at the stone door site. These particular geometric motifs, a repeating stepped diamond pattern, have been found at several confirmed ancestral Puebloan sites, where researchers generally interpret them as symbolic, possibly representing water migration paths or celestial cycles, according to accepted academic interpretation, though exact meanings remain genuinely debated within the field. The presence of a similar pattern at our mesa site doesn't prove any specific claim about what lies behind that stone door. It's important to be careful here. Pattern similarity across a region doesn't automatically mean a direct connection between two sites, and reputable archaeologists would rightly caution against reading too much into stylistic resemblance alone. Cultures separated by centuries and geography can independently develop similar decorative motifs. But it does place the stone door slab within a broader, verifiable visual language, one used by real, documented ancestral communities across this region for purposes we only partially understand today. If the slab is, in fact, of ancestral Puebloan origin, it wouldn't be an anomaly floating outside of history. It would be one more thread in a very large, still unfinished tapestry. There's a second, more speculative parallel worth mentioning carefully. Several other sites across the American Southwest have their own local legends of chambers or doorways within cliff faces or mesas, most famously in and around Chaco Canyon and parts of the Four Corners region. In almost every case investigated by professional archaeologists, these turned out to be either natural alcoves, storage granaries used by ancestral communities for keeping food and seed reserves, or in a smaller number of cases, ceremonial spaces that were intentionally closed off by the people who used them, not hidden from history, but respectfully sealed as part of a cultural or spiritual practice we, as outsiders, may never fully understand. That last possibility is worth sitting with. Not every closed door is a secret. Sometimes a door is closed because it was meant to be closed by the very people who built it, for reasons rooted in belief systems that predate written record. If the stone door in New Mexico is genuinely of ancestral origin, the most respectful conclusion might not be excavation at all, but restraint. So where's that leave us? We have a documented, physically described stone feature, verified independently by at least two credentialed researchers separated by nearly 2 decades. We have oral traditions from local communities that speak, in careful and general terms, of significance tied to this land. We have official records that grow quieter exactly where the story gets most interesting, and bureaucratic explanations that are plausible, even likely, but not quite airtight enough to close the file completely. We do not have proof of a hidden chamber. We do not have proof of what, if anything, lies behind that slab of stone. And we should be honest, we don't fully know a legitimate, and often necessary conclusion in historical mystery, not a failure of the investigation. What we're left with, in the end, is a door, a real, physical, measured, photographed door, sitting quietly in a mesa in New Mexico, exactly where it sat for who knows how long. 2 research efforts approached it, and for reasons that may be entirely mundane, or maybe something else entirely, never finished the job. Whether that's the mesa keeping a secret, or simply the slow, unglamorous way that underfunded research fades into the background, That's the part nobody has definitively answered yet. Maybe that's exactly how it's supposed to stay. Maybe some places are marked not for us to open, but for us to notice and to leave alone, a possibility worth taking seriously, especially given the traditions of the communities who have called this land home for far longer than any survey team. Or maybe one day, someone will finish what those two researchers started, and will finally know what, if anything, is waiting on the other side. Until then, the stone door stays shut, and the mesa keeps its silence. So, what do you think is really behind that door? A forgotten ceremonial chamber? A natural formation dressed up by decades of folklore? Or something the records were never meant to explain? Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more deep dives into the mysteries history left unfinished, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.